The deceptively simple strength of ethnography is to look at things up close, so as to foreground the complexity of human social lives. Take race and class, for instance. Racialized groupings in our society and our world are associated with particular social economic positions or statuses. And it's a commonplace of any social science to remind us that these associations are significant simplifications, that even if they reflect an average social economic position of persons of a given racialized grouping, that in fact, the persons of that racialized grouping exhibit a range of social economic positions. The same with educational attainment. Yet, in much social science that operates on a larger scale, after the variation is noted, it is often placed off stage rather than front and center. It's one of the great accomplishments of Shalina Shankar's Desi land, teen culture, class, and success in Silicon Valley that it doesn't let that happen. It keeps the complexity front and center. Throughout this extraordinary book, we as its readers must grapple with the class differences and class separations among Desis in dot-com-era Silicon Valley. Particularly important are the divergences between children of working-class families, albeit unusually well-waged and even well-salaried working-class families, and the children of upper-class professional families. Put simply, in Shankar's ethnography, class and race really do intersect rather than converge in an overly simple manner. In terms of our broad topic of inquiry this semester, schooling in mass societies, Shankar's work reminds us that our schools are embedded in larger social contexts and communities, and that there are complex interactions between primary and secondary socialization. In addition to Desiland, Shankar is also the author of a number of important essays, including Reel to Reel, Desi Teens' Linguistic Engagement with Bollywood, and a forthcoming essay on language and materiality. I should mention that she's also engaged in a new research project on advertising and racialized representations in advertising. She is an associate professor of anthropology and Asian American studies at Northwestern University, and I'm enormously pleased that she is here with us today to speak about style and language use among youth of the new immigration. Please join me in welcoming her.
Hello, everyone. It's a real pleasure to be here. Thank you so much, Dan, for that generous introduction. I'd like to acknowledge the Munroe Center for Social Inquiry for inviting me to participate in this very exciting series on schooling in mass societies. I'm honored to be a part of it, and especially to Dan for reaching out to me and extending an invitation to do so. Excuse me. I'd also like to acknowledge the Spencer Foundation for research related to education, as well as the Social Science Research Council's International Migration Program for funding portions of this research. And I'd also like to acknowledge Binghamton University and New York University for funding portions of the follow-up research for my study. So my talk today is on style and language use among youth of the new immigration, and it grows out of a larger research project that I've been working on for several years that I've mostly completed, but still have some data from, and I'm going to present some of that today. The project is on Desi, or South Asian American teenagers in Silicon Valley high schools and communities. I constructed an ethnographic study, which Dan mentioned, in which I look at the ways in which class backgrounds and immigration histories of teenagers intersect to shape their identities and their orientations towards school. I also look at aspects of their linguistic practices and cultural practices, as well as their engagements with media and popular culture. So the broader study is one of tracking generational change in Silicon Valley. It has aspects, I talk about aspects of social reproduction, as well as of generational change. And the full study is Desiland, Teen Culture, Class, and Success in Silicon Valley, which I published in 2008. Today, my talk draws on recorded materials, excerpts from spontaneously occurring conversation. And I want to use these excerpts to complicate the idea of language use in migration context. So the main questions that I want to look at today center on the question of how can we understand language use in the context of immigrant youth. Sometimes I call them immigrant youth, sometimes I call them diasporic youth. You kind of see them in this literature on migration referred to in a number of ways. So if I kind of toggle back and forth, I'll try to be as specific as I can there. So the main questions that I want to address today are, how do youth use language in school and organize their social worlds through style? How is language use for youth in the same ethnic group shaped by dynamics of class and gender? How is youth language use in schools linked to processes of ethnic and racial formation? And finally, how does an analysis of style offer alternatives to routinely used models of acculturation and assimilation? So these are interlinked questions, and I'll be looking at them together, especially in the transcripts that were handed out to you. So just to give you an overview of my talk, I'll start by talking about the role and significance of language use and elaborate on what I mean by style as a performance-based approach to language use. I'll then talk about the new immigration and Desis in Silicon Valley, as well as a description of youth cliques at schools. I'll then talk to you at length about the transcripts and analyze them in terms of gender, class, race, and ethnicity. And finally, conclude by discussing style, racialization, and political economy in schools, and return to the question of language and migration studies. I want to give you a sense of the methodologies that I used. As Dan mentioned, they are ethnographic, and I conducted ethnographic fieldwork from 1999 to 2001, and then did follow-up visits in 2005 and 2007, and thanks to the wonders of Facebook, I now know every last detail of student lives, possibly in ways that I didn't know even when I was doing fieldwork. I have also, so I did participant observation at 3 different public high schools. 2 of them were in San Jose, and 1 was in Fremont. I primarily did fieldwork outside of class, although I did do some classroom observations as well. I spent a lot of time with students at their homes, in religious spaces, in leisure spaces, and at community events. I conducted interviews with students, with teachers, faculty, parents, grandparents, and community leaders. So I got to talk to a fairly broad cross-section of this community. And I also made audio recordings of school break and lunch, some that I was present for, some that students just wore a microphone for me when I wasn't there. And so much of the profanity-laden recordings were done when I wasn't there, but they knew that they were being recorded. And I've used pseudonyms throughout for the names of the schools as well as for the students. Okay, so what I mean here by language use is similar to what linguistic anthropologists in general consider language to be, which is a dynamic, everyday social practice. I look at language use as it's informed by ideologies, both cultural and linguistic, by power, and by social difference. I think about also how language use informs identity, subjectivity, and community for youth. So language and migration studies has taken a slightly different approach to understanding the role of language in understanding the migration process. Just to give you a very brief overview of a couple of approaches, and I'll return to them at the end of my talk. The most commonly used model in migration studies is segmented assimilation, in which there's kind of a tracking of whether youth migrate upward or downward or assimilate sort of laterally with their ethnic group as generational change is tracked. So in this context, heritage language and English proficiency are looked at as part of segmented assimilation. And then language retention and loss are also looked at in the context of acculturation. So for instance, do youth maintain their heritage languages? Do they lose them? How, how do the parents acquire English proficiency and so on? These are looked at in acculturation studies that track generational change. Finally, language and transnationalism looks at how heritage languages are used in the in transnational activities, be it political, social, economic. In what ways do heritage languages enable the facilitation of these types of linkages with homelands and transnational communities elsewhere? So, keeping these in mind, my orientation is more toward anthropological approaches to language, especially in schools. A school of thought I found very interesting and useful is the linguistic anthropology of education, which looks at language use inside and outside the classroom, and it focuses on ethnographic approaches that really emphasize context-specific uses of language. I'm also interested in the effects of language policy on ethnography. So for instance, in my research in Silicon Valley, policy that was very relevant were Lau versus Nichols, the Supreme Court case that mandated bilingual education, and then Proposition 227, which then repealed bilingual education in California. Finally, ESL studies have also been very instructive in looking at language in schools because they not only look at the ways in which youth acquire English as a second language, but look at the broader social dynamics of how ESL classes often track youth as linguistic others, and it becomes very difficult to get out of this track. So in this broader context, I come to style and linguistic performance. So style shifts an emphasis from retention and loss to one of performance. In other words, what are youth actually doing with language beyond retaining it or losing it? So style consists of linguistic and material elements. Youth construct styles from language varieties by using different types of voices, ways of speaking, and making certain contextual choices, such as who they decide to speak it with, where they decide to speak it or not speak a particular language or language variety. Styles are also embodied practices. Much like the term style is commonly used, it's in this context it is also linked to ways of dressing, ways of wearing hair and makeup, of comportment, and a whole range of embodied practices with which language is linked. So styles take on a heightened meaning in a high school context. And it's in this context that the meanings that styles take on are really defined within a particular social system. So the styles I'll talk to you about today are particular to the high school that I looked at them in. They may or may not transfer to other high schools elsewhere, but it's that sort of particularity in which people take certain social and linguistic differences and make them into locally relevant categories that really interests me as a way of understanding inequality and power dynamics and social reproduction in schools. So heritage languages and English are the two areas that I'm most concerned with. So I've been using this term heritage language, which is were previously referred to as mother tongue. Some of you might know it as that. And the literature now calls them heritage languages, so I've shifted as well. They're ways of connecting to homelands. They're ways of connecting to diasporic populations elsewhere. And the heritage languages that were most common in the communities in which I worked were Punjabi, Gujarati, Hindi, and Urdu. Also important in my study are varieties of English. Now, English is often treated, especially in migration contexts, as a sort of a monolithic thing. You're either talking in a heritage language or English, but varieties of English are also extremely significant, especially in a youth context where there's a lot of innovation and a lot of different varieties and styles that influence how people use English. So Valley Girl, hip-hop language, lexicon, and elements from gangs, these are all things that really mark certain types of language use and make them distinct and recognizable. So what I want to talk about in the context of youth speech are which styles are preferred and dispreferred within particular groups. So in other words, why do some youth choose certain elements and disprefer other elements, and vice versa, to define the boundaries of their social group, as well as which elements are marked and unmarked in the context of schools. So in other words, which linguistic elements end up becoming sort of the norm or status quo in a school context, and which really stand out and catch usually the negative attention of faculty and administrators. So with this in mind, I'd like to tell you a little bit about the new immigration to Silicon Valley and youth cliques in high schools. So the new immigration refers to the post-1965 immigration, when the U.S. began to actively solicit professionals from various parts of the world. Many of them came from Asia. It also refers to waves of relatives that were sponsored by these early professionals. And this differs from early 20th century immigration because these earlier waves usually came as individuals. They weren't able to connect to their homelands as readily, and they came to a different climate. They usually came to a pre-civil rights climate. So in a post-civil rights America, especially in the era of multiculturalism, when I did my research, there's a much greater connection to heritage languages and cultures, and this sort of ongoing connection to homelands facilitated by new forms of communications. So these are things that anthropologists have really elaborated in studies of transnationalism and diaspora. This is a picture of the new Gurdwara or Sikh temple built in San Jose through extensive fundraising that the Sikh community in that region has done. So Desi immigration to Silicon Valley really coincided with the high-tech industry and the way it grew from the 1970s onward. And you see Desi families moving from South Asia, as well as from Africa, the UK, other regions of the US, and other regions of California to occupy different echelons of work in the high-tech industry, both professional managerial work as well as assembly line and production work. And this is a sign from the Livermore Temple, where those of you who are familiar with the Hindu ritual of getting your new car blessed, if you do it in California, they have reserved parking for you. So I thought that was very California. This is an aerial shot of South San Jose, and you can see these massive new housing developments that are built right into the hillside. And in the valley, which you can't see as easily down below, are the kind of older communities. So in these different spaces, Desis form these tightly knit ethnic communities that are very closely organized in these neighborhoods. The upper middle class Desis largely occupied these houses in the hills, and the lower middle class ones were able to buy in the 70s these smaller homes in the valley that then appreciated tremendously during the high-tech boom. So they had a lot of home equity and a lot of kind of disposable income from that home equity. This is, of course, before the housing crash that happened. So they were kind of in an unusual position because of the way this area developed so rapidly because of the tech industry. So class in Silicon Valley Desi communities, as I've been alluding to, is very significant in shaping youth lives. So lower middle class families in my study, the parents worked on assembly lines. They did janitorial work. Sometimes they worked, doing local shipping and trucking types of jobs. And as I mentioned, they're homeowners with a good degree of job stability, at least, until the last year or two. They live among lower middle class and working class whites, Asian Americans, and Latinos, and they live in the older neighborhoods in the valley. And by contrast, you have upper middle class Desi families who are primarily doing professional managerial work. They're upwardly mobile. They live among wealthy whites, Asian Americans, and Latinos, and they live primarily in these new developments of and gated communities in the hill regions in the photograph I just showed you. Teens, interestingly, because the way the real estate developed in Silicon Valley around the high-tech boom, the real estate developers moved much more quickly than the schools. Can you believe it? So what happened was that teens of very different class backgrounds often ended up at the same public schools. So you had upper middle class Desi teens at the same schools as working class Desi teens, and those differences were very stark. So Greene High School is one of the high schools in which I do research, and it's the one I'm going to talk about today. It's in South San Jose, California, and it had about 2,200 students. This didn't change much over the 2-year period I was there. It's 50% Asian American, about 30% of these are Desi. The other 2 major Asian American groups are Vietnamese American and Filipino American. 25% Latino, 12% white, and 6% African American, and less than 1% Native American. And as you can see from the math, it's one of those minority-majority, am I saying that right? Majority-minority? I think you know what I mean. More minorities than whites school. So which really created a very diverse environment. And in this environment, social cliques were very prominent. So the cliques were organized in different corners of the school campus. So they occupied different portions. They'd go to these places regularly every day, which really helped me find these same students day after day, because they would very predictably go to the exact same place to meet up with their friends between classes, at breaks, and at lunch. And these locations were really divided along class lines. So I used the student-derived social categories that I observed to describe these social cliques. So among Desi students, you had geeks who were very studious and spent most of their time kind of out of the way in classrooms, So I'm not going to talk about them here, but I talk about them extensively in my book if you'd like to learn more about the geeks. And they're very interesting. And then you have the populars, who are the popular students and the FOBs, which is an acronym for fresh off the boat. And these were the more marginalized Desi students. Now, these are terms that students use to refer to one another, but they didn't use them to refer to themselves. So, for instance, no one was going to announce their arrival as a FOB, but they would be called that by someone else, and the same with popular. So students were very aware of these labels, and they were really used in a fairly sophisticated system of social differentiation. So to give you a sense of what each of the cliques were like before we go into the transcript, populars were, excuse me, primarily second-generation youth. They lived in affluent neighborhoods and gated communities because they were the children of upper-middle-class families, and their parents were Silicon Valley professionals. Interestingly, one or both parents were usually fluent in English. They had been educated in English, and English was spoken at home alone or in combination with a heritage language, usually Punjabi, Gujarati, or Urdu. They were very central in school activities. They occupied the central quad area of their kind of open campus schools, and they also avoided using their heritage language at school. So popular styles included high-end clothing and accessories, Valley Girl elements, California slang, the use of like as a discourse marker. Girls gave great attention to hair and makeup, and they avoided anything that marked gangsta or gangster style for them. And boys also dressed in high-end chain clothing and avoided what would mark gangster style for them, including baggy pants and flannels and certain types of hairstyles. Less gender differentiation occurred between male and female popular styles. So by contrast, you have FOBs. Again, the acronym is fresh off the boat, but it's important to remember that these are not new immigrants. They're actually primarily second-generation youth. Some of them are 1.5 generation, which means that they immigrated during childhood and kind of came of age in the US. They live in working class neighborhoods, and their parents are lower middle class. And the parents speak their heritage language much more at home. They often spoke English as well, but they really spoke their heritage language and used it. Moreover, they use their heritage language at school. So at school, they were socially marginalized. They occupied the back corners of the school campus, and their cliques were much more ethnically homogenous. The popular cliques were much more diverse. They were all speaking in English, and it kind of was a mix of different ethnic groups in their cliques. But FOBs were much more homogenous. So FOB styles include lower-end fashion and accessories, some use of Valley Girl and California slang as well. They used heritage languages at school for jokes, for retelling events, for everyday conversation, as well as for speaking confidentially. And they primarily spoke in Punjabi and Hindi and Urdu. And many of them followed Sikh Punjabi religious prescriptions, which include modesty, propriety, and conservative comportment, but not her. There was greater gender differentiation between male and female FOB styles, and this really comes out in their language practices. So if you'll, does everyone have a transcript? Okay. I want to give you a little bit of context for the transcripts before I get into them. Gendered performances of linguistic styles do the important work of reproducing particular power dynamics in school, as well as social and cultural values across generations and communities. Gender differentiation was evident between the styles of popular girls and boys. Boys used common California slang such as dude, hella, which means very, and sweet, which means excellent. Their talk routinely included topics of cars, electronics, girls, social life, and college. My relatively limited observations of popular boys indicated that their speech practices at school were areas through which they constructed masculinity, negotiated topics of generational change, and considered their futures in Silicon Valley and elsewhere. The styles of popular girls, whom I observed and recorded more systematically, resembled a contemporary version of Valley Girl, in which expressions such as, oh my God, totally, and the discourse marker like abounded. Favored topics of discussion included hair, makeup, clothes, friends, boys, dating, college, disagreements with parents, and gossip. During special events and programs, popular girls displayed a great deal of pride in dance, music, and language that showcased their heritage culture and language. They could spend months choreographing a Bhangra or Bollywood-inspired dance, or choosing the perfect sari or lehenga to wear to prom. So example 1 on your handout typifies cultural and linguistic elements of popular style and illustrates how they construct sophisticated appearances and index sexual knowledge. Like other instances I observed, popular girls here spoke entirely in English about self-presentation and openly discussed topics of boys, prom dates, and sexuality. So example 1 is an excerpt that I made in a large, well-appointed bathroom of a popular girl's home. Her name was Shabana, and I did this recording in the hours preceding her school's junior prom. So Shabana and her friend Amal, who were both seniors, were helping several of their junior friends with their hair and makeup for the big dance. Shabana skillfully applied makeup and created attractive updo hairstyles for each makeover recipient, who sat in a folding chair facing the large mirror. Amal sat on the floor and handed her cosmetics and hair appliances, while I sat on the edge of the bathtub with an audio recorder. Even though they were not attending the dance, Shabana and Amal indicated their extensive knowledge about who would be there. Example 1, Christian's girlfriend is coming. Christian's little girl toy. Oh, who's that? This girl, it's not Washington, I don't think. It's like American. Girl toy? You know how we say boy toy? Well, she's a girl toy. In this exchange, Shabana and Amal use boy toy and girl toy to refer to peers who are sexually available and open to multiple partners. In line 6, Shabana responds to my query relating girl toy to boy toy, a term I have heard her friends and her use to refer to boys they flirt with and consider as potential dates for chaperone social events. She uses the pronoun we to index or indirectly refer to the shared understanding of the term within her popular clique. Such usage would be commonplace among mainstream American teenagers, but runs counter to norms about sexual awareness and propriety held by many Silicon Valley Desi communities. Depending on their level of religiosity, families expected their teenage children, especially their daughters, to abstain from dating and sexual intimacy until after marriage. Shabana and Amal, who are held to these expectations by their observant Muslim families, would not use such language when speaking with adults in family or community settings. They enjoy doing so, however, with their friends. Popular girls' styles enable them to display sexual knowledge with their peers, and gender and sexuality are co-constructed through language about desire. Such talk could easily occur in school, where topics of dating and sexual activity are commonplace. Popular girls are less concerned that their conversations would be reported to their parents or make them the object of unfavorable gossip. Unlike FOB teens, whose school and community worlds overlap more significantly, popular social cliques tended to be small, insular, and exclusive, all things that enabled them to keep their private conversations, such as this one, much more confidential. Excuse me. FOB teen styles overlap somewhat with that of popular teens in that they, excuse me, like most California teens, make frequent use of the discourse marker like and elements of Valley Girl style, such as totally and oh my god. Unlike their popular peers, FOB teens also used Punjabi or Hindi or Urdu at school to report quoted speech, to relay humorous family and community incidents, and to simply speak with one another. As I noted earlier, FOB styles of speaking, interaction, and comportment vary greatly from those of newly arrived immigrants because they draw on a wide range of linguistic and cultural markers that would only be available to insiders with extensive local knowledge. FOB girls and boys differed in the ways that they performed styles that indexed clique membership. Even at school, FOB girls expressed greater concern about the ways in which their dress, speech, and comportment might be perceived. Most FOB teens at Greene High School attended the same Gurdwara or Sikh temple, and their families socialized together in close-knit communities. The norms of these communities, especially for more religious Sikh Punjabi girls, included abstaining from premarital sexual and social relations with boys, avoiding clothing, makeup, and hairstyles that would be considered immodest, and also using language that could be read as unfeminine. FOB boys are not officially allowed to be romantically or sexually involved with girls, but are under far less pressure to conform to this expectation. Although girls commonly followed these prescriptions with their families and communities, school was a place where they selectively pushed these boundaries. Knowing that their FOB peers could quickly make them the subject of gossip if transgressions were too blatant or frequent, girls performed ethnicity, toughness, and other FOB attributes of style with an eye toward their reputations. Because FOB girls are so readily judged by their male and female peers, socializing can prove to be a complicated endeavor. When girls choose to date, they tend to do so on what they call the DL, or down low, in which both parties are discreet about the relationship and make strategic decisions about when and where to meet. So in example 2 on your handout, Inderpreet has grown impatient with the unrealistic requests of her boyfriend Avinash to hold dance rehearsals for an upcoming International Day performance at his house. So part of the frustration arises because Inderpreet, unlike most of her FOB friends, has decided to extend herself into a sphere where she is not entirely comfortable, that of school activities. In an unusual turn, popular girls and FOBs decided to collaborate on a dance for International Day. So this situation arose when popular girls needed more Desi girls for a dance, and a handful of FOB girls agreed, since they enjoyed performing their heritage culture and had no other way into the program. So here Inderpreet makes her frustration known to Avinash and her female friend Manjeet. Inderpreet: whatever, bitch. No, I'm not practicing at your house. Why can't you practice at my house? That's fucking rude, Inderpreet. Oh my God, you made me say fucking. Yeah, you made her say fucking. You go to his house, right? It's not like you're gonna go there for the first time and like, ah! If there's, sorry, that wasn't a good scream. If there's, do you think I'm gonna get caught? Do you think my parents are gonna let me go? No. Then why risk it? Inderpreet compellingly performs a tough FOB style to emphasize her point. She addresses Avinash as bitch, which is not technically profanity, but nonetheless far more marked than calling another girl a bitch or using a term more commonly used to insult men. FOB girls may use profanity for casual talk or joking, but I rarely observe them using bitch in an interaction with a boy. Indexes of toughness in this conversation do not conform with gendered expectations of use, so much so that Manjeet and Avinash remark on and offer meta-pragmatic assessments or reflections on their own speech, in particular about the terms bitch and fucking. Manjeet is the first to remark on Inderpreet's language and uses profanity herself to emphasize its severity, which she subsequently corrects in line 4 and Avinash mocks in line 5. By using tough language and taking an aggressive line of confrontation in which she screams to emphasize her point, Inderpreet is finally able to get Avinash and Manjeet to acknowledge that attending a group dance rehearsal at Avinash's house is qualitatively different than their secret trysts on the DL. Such prohibitions do not similarly restrict male language use, and FOB boys openly use profanity and other elements to index toughness regardless of topic. So in example 3, Kuldeep displays his solidarity with Farooq. It's on the other side of your handout. A Muslim Punjabi-speaking boy who transferred from the United Kingdom a few months earlier. Born and raised in a town near Birmingham, Farooq quickly settled into this FOB clique and tells Kuldeep about his girl problems. So my girlfriend wants to leave me now. Why, foo? You guys are so happy together all the time. Yeah, but now her ex-boyfriend is coming into our life. Her ex-boyfriend asked her out again. Kick his ass, foo. I am. I'll come with you. I'm fucking angry right now, foo. You and me? Oh, for sure I'll come with you. I'll fucking kill that motherfucker. Beat his ass. Cut the motherfucker's throat. Yeah, he's coming in really now. I'm gonna beat him down hella hard. Rather than encouraging what might become an extensive lament about Farooq's imminent breakup, Kuldeep swiftly shifts the tenor of the conversation from feelings to fighting in line 5. Kuldeep's lexical and phonological choices, including kick his ass, foo, fucking angry, and cut the motherfucker's throat, typify FOB style. Here, they do the work of assuring Farooq, a relative newcomer to the clique, to take a more aggressive stance about the threat posed to his relationship. After indicating uncertainty in lines 6 and 8, Farooq gains confidence in his performance of FOB style through Kuldeep's encouragement and support and adopts a more aggressively masculine stance through the phrase, beat his ass in line 10. By line 12, he emphatically uses the regional California descriptor, hella, to prove his point. These examples show how gender is integral to shaping experiences for diasporic youth. Although an emphasis on or avoidance of sexual topics and aggressive stances can index gender differently for FOB and popular girls, neither may be thought to index acculturation and can end up being overlooked altogether. Variance in style, as demonstrated through language use, indicates fundamental differences in how girls of different cliques, as well as boys and girls, do not experience the same subjectivity in school, even within the same ethnic group. Dynamics of race and class further emphasize this point. So in the final example, number 4, emphasizes constructions of race and ethnicity. Although Desi teens rarely spoke explicitly about their class status or racial positioning vis-a-vis other groups in the area, they did discuss who lived in the wealthy gated communities of the hills alongside other Asian American, Latino, and white families versus who lived in the smaller, older homes on the flat land immediately surrounding the school. Most FOBie teens lived in this latter area and referred to it as the hood. An African American term that is derived from neighborhood and can refer to low-income residential areas or subsidized housing projects, although this was neither of those situations. Although living in the hood did not mean performing styles that index this socioeconomic status, many teens in FOBie cliques chose to do so. They used distinct language varieties, lexical items, phonological features, and employed social voices to construct styles that index marked class and ethnic categories in their schools. Performing these voices with lexical and phonological emphasis enables FOBie teens to demonstrate a sense of belonging to their neighborhoods and to their clique in ways that contrast with the devices used by populars. Their styles overlapped but remained distinct from their peers in the hood, whom they refer to as Mexicans or Hispanics, and I here use the term Latinos, and Vietnamese, I use the term Vietnamese Americans. Inasmuch as FOBie styles are used within groups to create a sense of solidarity and belonging, teens also use them to differentiate themselves from and take stances against cliques of other races and ethnicities, especially Latino and Vietnamese American youth from their hood. Interactions I observed between FOBie teens and youth of other ethnic groups were not always tense, but fights could break out with very little forewarning. Past incidents and potential fights were favorite topics among FOBie boys, and they consistently depicted themselves as dominant and triumphant. So in example 4, Kuldeep alludes to an upcoming fight and attempts to convince his female friend Ruby to share any details that she may have. They said I was being set up to dog. That's what I heard. Thought you said maybe. Not the whole crew, but 2 guys. That's what I heard. 2 Hispanic guys? I don't know. Tell me. Can't say nothing because you know who he is. Tell me. I can't say nothing. I have to keep it on the DL. I just needed to find out from my homegirl. Yeah, well, I already found out everything. Some guy. Me and my homeboy's gonna punk his ass. Oh, you remembered? Oh, yeah, me and my homeboys are gonna jump his ass. I know everything. I live in the hood. Come on. So Kuldeep and Ruby's performance index an ethnically marked class-based toughness through the use of lexical items from regional gang culture. Kuldeep's style incorporates homeboys in line 13, the gang term jump in line 15, as a form of hostile attack or initiation, in this instance the former, and punk his ass in line 13 to refer to physically but not sexually violent acts. By reminding his peers that he lives in the hood in line 16, he downplays the need for Ruby's help, especially once he realizes that she will not offer any more specific information. So this exchange further illustrates how gendered performances of FOBie style enable youth to index toughness to one another and use it to emphasize ethnic and racial difference. Ruby is already in a position of power and can avoid using language that sounds excessively tough, like interpreet, or using profanity like manjeet, both from example 2. Instead, she chooses stylistic elements such as homegirl to refer to her informant and DL to underscore her commitment to secrecy in order to demonstrate her position of power without using language that would transgress gendered social boundaries. In these ways, styles matter to youth, while they also contribute to larger processes of ethnic and racial formation at school. Popular teens were quick to describe this sort of tough language as gangsta or ghetto and sought to avoid it because of the less prestigious status it indexes. FOBie teens were less concerned with how their style contrasted with popular teens and focused more on how their speech indexed gendered values within their group. The term FOB itself, along with assessments of peer language, indicate that these are reflexive categories that organize the migration experience. In example 2, Manjeet offers assessments of her own speech and interprets because she does not want to flout the norms of her ethnic community that would make her the object of gossip. While concerned with gossip within their clique, FOBie teens did not express concern about how their styles might run counter to the school norms of language use. They did not use this language to speak with teachers or parents, but did use it in their presence when they thought they could not be heard. While popular teens also did not always consider school norms, their choices were in line with school standards of propriety. These youth performances of style index ethnicity and class-based attributes and demonstrate the richness of experience that defies simple reductions of immigrant and American. So I began by talking about style and migration and racialization. And I want to return to this question of assimilation. You know, whether people, whether the second generation will move upward into white society, downward into black society, or laterally into some sort of co-ethnic arrangement. The reason I find assimilation does not fully encompass the range of experiences when you look at youth language use is both because Blackness and whiteness are complicated categories, especially in places that are Asian and Latino dominated, such as much of California. And so style draws attention to the subject positions that youth may inhabit that aren't of their own choosing, but that nonetheless contribute to their own racialization. So racialization certainly happens, but I think it happens in more nuanced ways depending on the context. So looking at style and racialization for popular teens, we see that there's a real strategic management of ethnic and racial difference in a school context. The performance of cultural and linguistic heritage is done in these very controlled ways that don't challenge the racial hegemony of the school. Their language indexes their upper middle class neighborhoods and lifestyles, and as such, they constitute the unmarked norm of the school. As a result, what I observed is that teachers really praise popular students, especially those that excel academically, and really choose them for enrichment activities and, and for other types of school leadership positions. So in this sense, they're racialized as white, along with upper middle class white, Asian American, and Latino youth in their neighborhoods. Style and racialization for FOBs happens in a different way. FOBs challenge the racial hegemony of their school with their speech from the hood, including profanity, tough language, and lexical and phonological items from African American English. They index working class styles alongside Latinos and Vietnamese American youth, and they already have a marginal status that they occupy in schools. Their language practices and styles are very marked at school in that they draw the unwanted attention of teachers and faculty. They're often overlooked for enrichment, and moreover, their use of heritage languages in school can mark them as potentially needing ESL, especially when faculty are kind of patrolling the schoolyard trying to get a sense of what's going on, and they're only hearing students talking in their heritage languages. So in this way, they're racialized as brown along with other working class Latinos and Vietnamese American youth who are marginal in the school. Finally, style and political economy are important to keep in mind, especially in the context of social reproduction, in that popular teens' parental involvement in their schooling is largely responsible for their use of unmarked language at school, and they're reserving their heritage language and culture for performances. These are values that their parents instill in them because of their sophisticated understanding of the school system based on their class status. FOBie teens' parents are less aware of school norms. Their teens use heritage languages and marked varieties of English in schools, and their parents are somewhat less concerned about their time at school, not because they don't care deeply about their children's well-being, but because there's a greater emphasis on life outside of school, including varying notions of success. So to conclude, just language use and migration studies, using youth social categories as a starting place to understand their social worlds is useful because social cliques are not usually examined in migration studies, but they can really reveal a lot about broader questions that interest migration scholars, especially that of racial and class formations. Different ways of understanding generational groupings and the occult and feelings of acculturation that are linked to them are also useful here because these social cliques can cross-cut generational categories, and being second generation can mean very different things depending on one's class background. And they experience very different subjectivities at school based on their clique affiliations. So it's important to note the sort of variance within this ethnic group that style permits us to see. Finally, it complicates this immigrant versus American dichotomy because these styles aren't easily classified as either or. If you're inclined to say that the popular style is more American and the FOB style is more immigrant, I would challenge that by saying they're both much more complicated and both draw on each of their, they both draw on South Asian culture as well as a number of other influences to in constructing these styles. So they're not easily reducible to these categories. So looking at youth performance is a way to understand longer-term outcomes in a migration context, and a focus on linguistic performance can be a way of understanding racialization, gender differences, and political economy. So thank you very much. So with regard to your first question as to who they speak the languages with, what it sounds like when they talk to kids outside of their clique, it's much less pronounced than when they're doing it within their own group. And in this talk, I didn't include any transcripts that include their heritage languages. Obviously, those they would only do with other speakers. But, one of the interesting things is that they didn't socialize very much outside of their cliques. And, they would have kind of casual conversations with other students in a school context about school matters that weren't particularly distinctive. Where these styles really were performed were in these fighting contexts with kids of other racial and ethnic groups. So you saw when they were interacting with Vietnamese American kids or Mexican American kids, there was a lot of posturing that went on, especially on boys. So these styles were really heightened there. As for your question about performance, I was thinking about it less in terms of something that they were performing in a disingenuous way, and more that that there was something very dynamic about the way language is actually used in a particular context, rather than thinking about heritage languages as this kind of like a commodity that one had or didn't have. So I was really looking at use, and in that sense, I use performance, like in the almost in the classic Judith Butler sense of, ontology versus performance. That there isn't something essential about having a heritage or knowing a heritage language. It's only in its performance that it unfolds, and there's some social meaning read into it depending on the context. Does that help define it?
I wasn't thinking so much about heritage language here, but the transcripts that you
Yes.
give us, right?
Yes.
The use of a particular kind of English.
Yes, of the English varieties, yes.
And the performance of that.
Yes, yes.
And so to what extent, that was...
Okay, so the fact that they're using African American English and they're using, okay.
Language kind of thing, is that the risk that is sort of being made and
We'll see.
that it's performed, or...
See, I'm still using performance in the same way, but I think that this question of appropriation can certainly be raised, especially in the context of their use of African American language, and they themselves are very aware of this, because that's why there's all of this talk about being from the hood. So they have a sense of ownership over these language varieties that they're using, that they are not just, they're not just using gang lexicon, but their friends are in gangs, which is actually true. Some of their friends were in gangs. And, they did live in these rough neighborhoods, and they were able, and they certainly overplay that at times because they're not as rough as other rough inner city rough neighborhoods, but they certainly didn't look like these gated communities either. So I think insofar as they felt a sense of belonging and ownership over those language varieties, they used them in ways that I don't think felt disingenuous to them as speakers. And they certainly, no one ever they didn't make fun of each other for using them. And people on the outside were making fun of them for all kinds of things, so it was hard to know where that line was drawn. Yes, you in the front, and then I'll get, and then you, and then you.
Can you expand on, you mentioned briefly about certain languages being marked, depending
Yes.
on what language they use. I'm sorry. You mentioned about certain groups being marked based on the language they use, whether it's the hood or using something from a more popular
Mm-hmm.
dialect. Could you maybe expand on that a little bit here?
How some things come to be marked in a school context?
How exactly do these, how exactly do I guess you want to call administrators kind of separate these two types of business?
Yeah, I mean, I didn't get to go into great detail here, but from what I can tell, the teachers and administrators, part of this work gets done in terms of how well these students perform in school. And it's not just academically, but it's also socially. So if you have students, like many of these popular students, who are constantly kind of adding positive value to the school by doing pep rallies and shows and being in leadership and really, they're really doing these very overt displays of school spirit. These teachers take note and faculty take note, and, these students end up running for leadership positions, and they're all very linked. And their language, too, because they're in so much of the public eye, is very carefully monitored. They're not going to shout profanities when the teacher is a foot away from them. They're not going to risk their status at school, because these are kids who are bound for four-year colleges, and they want to look good when they apply to college. So all of these things are very much interlinked, whereas FOBby teens, they had much less at stake in terms of school. They didn't feel a great sense of ownership over the school, and they honestly didn't care very much about what they were overheard speaking outside the context of their own social group. So in that way, they were much more concerned about how these meanings would circulate within their group, and much less concerned about the consequences of being heard by these administrators. And often they would swear in Punjabi or other languages so that they wouldn't be as easily found out by the administrators. But this language still shows up as marked in a school context, because profanity, languages other than English, especially in California schools, are often, raised red flags, especially in these overcrowded schools where these administrators are legitimately overwhelmed in trying to manage the linguistic diversity and meet the needs of students who actually need help. And then you've got these students that they can't quite place. Why the kind of implicit assumption of this unmarked English norm in these schools is that, well, why would you speak any other language than English if you could speak English? That's kind of the underlying assumption. If you can speak English, what are you doing speaking some other language? And this is the sort of hegemony of English in these public schools. It just, talking to these administrators, that there is a real sense that I got that, well, if they can speak English well, they'd be speaking English. So there must be something that makes them speak this other language, and, it's my job to find out. So, you'd often have these students, and I can talk to you more about it later, but there's also something called a California Home Language Survey, and it's in other states too, that really tries to assess if there are languages other than English spoken in your home, you have to be tested. And a lot of these kids don't test well to begin with. They would probably, not do well on an English test in any event, regardless of what was spoken in their home. So there are a number of interrelated factors that would position some of these kids as marked or unmarked. So it's a very long answer to your question.
No, sorry, I think you actually answered it quite well.
Okay, great. Yes, and then you.
Can you talk about the use of ethnic slurs between the popular kids and the
Mm-hmm.
but I've heard people of different races, but different, sorry, of same races, but different classes use derogatory terms, and then also about religious slurs between the different religions. Is that common?
I didn't see much of either of those things. I didn't, I mean, I saw kind of like joking, like jokes about these things. There was, to their credit, not a lot of religious tension. It was something that in their communities, and I did most of this research pre 9/11, but there wasn't a lot of interreligious tension. It was pretty, these groups got along fairly well in Silicon Valley. I think being very spatially dispersed helped. Everyone had their own place of worship, so there wasn't a lot of tension along those lines. Sometimes there were kind of joking slurs within certain groups that were familiar with one another's caste status. So for instance, within Sikh Punjabi communities, there were two castes that were very prevalent in Silicon Valley, Jat and Sani. And Jat and Sani caste collision happened, and there was tension and gossip between the two, but I wouldn't call it slurs. So in other words, more tension occurred within a group sometimes than across the groups. They were less concerned with one another. Yes, you had a question.
My question has to do with code switching.
Yes.
So in California, especially, I'm speaking specifically of the Latino community.
Yes.
Spanglish is a huge thing and a huge issue in the schools, and I'm wondering if you encountered any sort of mixing of the heritage languages with English and the reaction to that in the interviews that you did with parents and community members or even the administration, if it occurred.
It occurred a lot, especially with FOBI boys, because they loved to code switch and do so loudly. Like they'd kind of shout across, I'd shout to you where you're sitting, like something really lewd as a joke.
I mean, like within, like
And-
Spanglish, like within one sentence, one like choppy words, like this one's in this language, this one's in English, and to an outside speaker it makes absolutely no sense, but to a speaker who speaks both of those languages, yeah, it's fine.
Well, code switching can actually happen in a number of ways. That sort of alternation can either happen at the word level, it can happen at the phrase level, it can happen, within the same kind of speech event using both of them. So that was happening. I don't think it was a real cause for concern outside of what I was referring to in terms of being kind of marked in a school context. In fact, I think it was a valued activity from a community perspective because the adults were doing it as well. It's not, I think there's some broader ideologies at play between these languages in Silicon Valley, where Desis are kind of generally thought of as an upwardly mobile, well-positioned community, and the kind of nationwide backlash against Spanish as a way of, as a language, it's just, there are different ideologies surrounding them. So people there's less sort of vilification of some of these languages compared to Spanish, which, the US has had a much more sort of deep-seated anti-immigrant, they use it as an anti-immigrant vehicle sometimes, in ways that, when you can't insult people, you can still insult a language. So I think there are very different ideological connotations that didn't exist around some of these South Asian languages in the same way.
But you did mention that when students seem to speak too much of their mother language, that they
Yes.
would put in ESL classes as.
They were certainly marked as needing further testing for ESL classes, and then some of them would end up in ESL classes. So yes, speaking a language other than English, and I think it could be any language, but yes. So in a school context, it was very dangerous. In a community context, it was very valued, and this is where the class difference comes in, because these lower middle class families didn't necessarily tell their children and socialize them, don't do this at school. It didn't occur to them. It wasn't a set of parameters they were aware of. Thanks. Yes?
In another of your works, you mentioned that some of these FOBI boys might use Spanish as a way to maybe mock administrators for confusing them with people who are of Latino ethnicity.
Yes.
If you sort of could derive any, whether it be like subversion of this U.S. ideal of monolingualism, or
Mm-hmm.
maybe on the other, by the same token, some sort of display of heritage nationalism or pride.
I'm sorry, could you just, are you contrasting those two things, or?
I guess maybe you gave this example of them using Spanish
Yes.
as a way to sort of subvert this idea of maybe ethnicity at the school.
Yeah, the idea that administrators, there is an example that I think you're referring to where these administrators sometimes can't tell the difference between these South Asian boys and these Latino boys, and the South Asian kids think that the Desi kids think this is hilarious, and that they think these administrators are idiots, that they can't tell what is a very obvious difference to them. And so they do use Spanish kind of as a joke, among themselves, because they expect that the administrators will think about that. And so can you just rephrase what you'd like me to say?
I was wondering if you could remark upon, if maybe this is me just reading into it not overly political way, but if they would use another language to subvert the ideal of monolingualism, or if they maybe some sort of display of their pride and their heritage or nationalism.
So are they using Spanish to subvert their own nationalism?
No, if they're using their
Sorry.
own their heritage language.
To display nationalism.
Or subvert the U.S. ideal of monolingualism.
Absolutely, yes. And I think they're doing it first and foremost against the school, but to them the school embodies this U.S. ideal of monolingualism, of a lot of institutional evil, that they're not very concerned whether it's at the school level, state level, or national level, but that basically these systems are in place in ways that are not benefiting them. And they have very few tools of rebellion, right? I mean, language is one of the only tools that they have that they can readily access to display this sort of sense of pride and nationalism. And even within these FOBI teens, the girls won't do it in the same way because they don't want to draw the kind of negative attention that the boys are willing to do. And a lot of this, the Sikh Punjabi community in Silicon Valley has a great deal of pride visibly. There's a lot of national pride, but it's also kind of state pride about the state of Punjab that spans both India and Pakistan. So, you see the Sikh Khanda, the swords, and you see all of these other markers of Sikhism on car windshields and on bumper stickers and flags displayed on homes. So there is this sort of Sikh nation idea, and that certainly is espoused through their language. So thank you for your question. Yes, Dan.
Yeah, I ask everybody to thank Professor Shankar, and there's the reception outside, and please continue the conversation and questions out there informally.
Thank you so much. I really enjoyed this.